Late at night in the quiet of my room, I never imagined my world was about to shatter. The soft hum of the ceiling fan filled the air, and the glow of my bedside lamp barely lit the darkness. I was asleep, lost in dreams, unaware of the presence that had entered my space. It wasn't the creak of the floorboards that woke me, it was a feeling, a shift in the air, that eerie sense that someone was watching. My eyes fluttered open, and in the dim light, I saw him, my stepfather, standing in the doorway. At first, my mind struggled to make sense of it. Maybe I was dreaming, or maybe he needed something. But then I saw the look on his face, hesitation mixed with something else, something that didn't belong. A chill ran down my spine. Why was he here? Why now? My heart pounded against my ribs as I pulled the blanket up, suddenly feeling exposed. He took a step closer, and I felt frozen in place, every instinct screaming at me to move, to run, to do something. But I couldn't. This was the man my mother trusted, the man who had smiled at our dinner table, who had promised to take care of us. I had never questioned his presence in our lives before, but in that moment, something inside me told me that trust was a lie, that everything I thought I knew was about to come crashing down. I wanted to believe there was an explanation. I wanted to believe he wasn't about to cross a line that should never be crossed. Then, just as suddenly as he had come, he turned and walked away. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me in silence, but the weight of that moment didn't leave with him. It sat heavy on my chest, pressing down with a truth I wasn't ready to face. What had just happened? And more importantly, what did it mean? I couldn't sleep after that. My mind raced with questions, with possibilities I didn't want to consider. My mother's laughter echoed in my head. How she had always defended him, how she had believed in him. Did she know something I didn't? Or was she just as blind to the truth as I had been? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, everything felt different. The house looked the same. My mother greeted me with her usual warmth, and my stepfather sat at the table as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that our family was built on something fragile, something that was already starting to crack, and I was about to find out just how deep those cracks ran. Because that night wasn't the first sign. It was just the first one I had noticed. And once you see the truth, there's no going back. The morning passed in a blur, but my mind stayed locked on the night before. I watched my stepfather carefully, searching for any sign that he knew I had been awake, that I had seen him. But he acted normal. Too normal. He laughed at my mother's jokes, read the news on his phone, and sipped his coffee like nothing had changed. But everything had changed for me. I could barely eat. Every bite felt like it would get stuck in my throat. My mother noticed. She always noticed. "Are you okay?" she asked, placing a hand on my arm. Her touch was warm, familiar, safe. It made me want to tell her everything. But I hesitated. What would I even say? That I had woken up in the middle of the night and found the man she loved standing in my room? That he left without a word, but something about it felt wrong? I wasn't even sure how to explain it to myself. I forced a small smile. "Just tired," I mumbled. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. That day, I paid more attention than I ever had before. I watched the way my mother looked at him, the love in her eyes, the trust. Did she have any idea what kind of man he really was? Or had she seen things before and chosen to ignore them? The thought made my stomach turn. Then there was him. He barely looked at me. But maybe that was the point. Maybe he was pretending nothing had happened. Maybe he thought I had slept through it. I didn't know what was worse, the idea that he had been testing some kind of boundary, or that he had done this before and I had just never noticed. I started remembering small things, moments I had brushed off before, the way his eyes lingered a little too long sometimes, the times he would walk past me and his hand would graze my shoulder, my back, too light to be anything obvious, but enough to make my skin crawl. Had I really been so blind? I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. I didn't even know what I was looking for. But one thing was certain, this wasn't just in my head. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out what it was, no matter what it took. That night, I locked my door. It wasn't something I had ever done before, but I couldn't shake the overthinking everything. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and I needed to protect myself. I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump. The house, which had always felt safe, now felt different. Too quiet, too dark, too full of secrets. I kept replaying the moment from the night before, trying to make sense of it. Why had he been there? What was he thinking? Was it a mistake, or was there something more? The questions circled in my head until I felt dizzy with them. The next morning, I checked my mother's face for any sign that something was wrong. But she was the same as always, moving around the kitchen, humming softly as she poured coffee. She had no idea, and that realization made everything worse. If I told her, would she believe me? Would she even want to believe me? I wasn't sure. Then something happened that made my stomach drop. My stepfather's phone was left on the counter while he stepped away. A message popped up, just one, a name I didn't recognize, and beneath it, a short text. When can I see you again? I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Was this the real secret he was hiding? Was my mother being betrayed just like I felt I had been? I didn't have answers yet, but one thing was clear. Whatever was going on in this house, it was much worse than I had thought, and I needed to find the truth before it was too late. I couldn't get that message out of my head. When can I see you again? The words haunted me, replaying over and over like a warning. I knew I had to be careful. If my stepfather was hiding one thing, he was probably hiding more. But I needed proof. Something undeniable. Something my mother couldn't ignore. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual, listening to the sounds of the house. My stepfather went to bed like always, his door closing softly behind him. My mother followed a little later. For a while, everything was still, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about his phone. If he was having an affair, what else was he capable of? I waited until the house was silent. Then, as quietly as I could, I crept out of my room. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved down the hall, every shadow feeling like it was watching me. His office door was slightly open, the faint glow of a screen lighting the room. I took a deep breath and stepped closer. Inside, my stepfather sat at his desk, staring at his phone. His expression was unreadable, but then, just as I was about to slip away, he spoke. "You shouldn't be up this late." A chill ran through me. I hadn't made a sound. How had he known I was there? My body froze, my breath caught in my throat. He turned his head slightly, just enough to let me know he was aware of my presence. I forced myself to speak. "I couldn't sleep." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, slowly, he placed his phone face down on the desk and turned toward me. His eyes held something I couldn't quite read, something that sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "Go back to bed," he said, his voice calm but firm. I hesitated, but then I saw it. The way his hand tightened around the edge of his desk, the way his jaw tensed. Something was wrong, and I had the sinking feeling that whatever secrets he was keeping, I was getting too close to uncovering them. I turned and walked back to my room, but every step felt heavy. I could still feel his eyes on me, like he was waiting for something, waiting to see if I would push further. My hands were shaking as I closed my door, locking it again. Something wasn't right. I had felt it before, but now I knew it. He wasn't just hiding something. He was afraid of being found out. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind raced, replaying that moment over and over. The way he had known I was there, the way his grip tightened on the desk. He wasn't just surprised to see me, he was nervous. But why? The message on his phone suggested an affair, but this was something else, something bigger. The next morning, my mother left early for work, leaving just me and him in the house. I could hear him moving around in the kitchen, making coffee like it was any other day. But I couldn't pretend anymore. I needed answers. I waited until he stepped away from his phone, then took a deep breath and moved quickly. My hands trembled as I picked it up, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. The screen was still unlocked. My stomach twisted as I scrolled through the messages. And then I saw it. Not just texts from another woman, but something else. Messages about me. She's starting to suspect something. You need to handle this before she talks. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about me. He wasn't just keeping secrets. He was planning something. Before I could process what I was reading, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my body frozen in fear. My stepfather stood in the doorway, his eyes dark, unreadable. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice eerily calm. My heart pounded as I realized I had just crossed a line I couldn't step back from. Whatever was happening, I was in deeper than I ever could have imagined. And now, I didn't know if I would make it out. I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing. My stepfather took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said again, his voice lower this time. I forced myself to speak. "What does this mean? Who are you talking to?" My voice was shaking, but I didn't care. He sighed, rubbing his hand over his face like he was exhausted. "You don't understand," he muttered. "This isn't what you think." But I did understand. I knew that look in his eyes now. It wasn't anger, it was fear. He wasn't just worried about me knowing the truth. He was afraid of what I might do with it. Then something happened that neither of us expected. My mother's voice rang out from behind him. "What isn't what she thinks?" My breath caught. She was supposed to be at work. But there she was, standing in the doorway, staring at him. I saw it in her eyes, the confusion, the realization that something was very, very wrong. My stepfather opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, I made my choice. I turned the phone around, showing her the messages. Her face drained of color. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice I had never heard from her before, calm, steady, but full of something dangerous, she said, "Get out." He tried to argue, but she didn't let him. I watched as she grabbed his things, as she forced him out the door, and just like that, he was gone. But as I stood there, shaken, I couldn't shake one thought. If my mother hadn't come home early, what would he have done to me? The house felt different after he was gone, lighter almost, but the weight of everything that had happened still clung to me. My mother sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. She hadn't said much after throwing him out. Neither of us had. There was too much to process, too much damage left behind. I sat across from her, staring at the phone still clutched in my hand. The messages were burned into my mind. "She's starting to suspect something. You need to handle this before she talks." What had he planned? What would have happened if I hadn't checked his phone? If my mother hadn't come home when she did? The thought made my stomach twist. My mother finally looked at me. Her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Guilt. I should have seen it, she whispered. I should have known. I shook my head. It's not your fault. And I meant it. She had trusted him, just like I had, just like anyone would have. She reached across the table, gripping my hand tightly. We'll be okay, she said. We'll get through this. And for the first time in days, I believed her. The next morning, we changed the locks. His things were packed and left outside. He tried calling, tried texting, but we didn't answer. Whatever power he had over our lives was gone. It would take time to heal. The trust we had once had in the world was broken, and we would have to rebuild. But as my mother and I sat together that night, watching an old movie like we used to, I realized something important. We had each other, and that was enough.